This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. When a criminal case reaches a verdict, the outcome is often summarized in a single sentence: guilty or not guilty. But to understand what that verdict actually means, it is necessary to examine the specific charges involved. In the case of Ghislaine Maxwell, the charges brought against her were not broad or undefined. They were clearly structured under federal law, each with its own legal definition, requirements, and evidentiary standards. Understanding these charges is the first step. Because a conviction does not apply to every allegation or every aspect of a broader investigation, it applies only to the counts that were formally charged and proven in court. The charges against Maxwell focused on her role in facilitating and participating in specific criminal activities connected to Jeffrey Epstein. These were not general accusations of association. Instead, prosecutors outlined specific actions that they argued were supported by evidence, including witness testimony and documented records. Each charge had to meet a legal threshold. This means that prosecutors were required to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Maxwell's actions satisfied the elements defined by law. These elements are precise. They describe what must be demonstrated for a conviction to occur. For example, certain charges involved transportation-related offenses, while others focused on conspiracy. Conspiracy charges are particularly important in complex cases. They do not require that an individual personally carry out every action, but rather that they knowingly participated in an agreement to engage in illegal conduct. This expands the scope of legal responsibility. However, it also increases the burden of proof, as prosecutors must demonstrate both knowledge and participation, not just presence or association. Another important point is that charges are case-specific. They are based on particular timeframes, locations, and sets of evidence. This means that even within a larger investigation, only certain events may be included in the trial. Understanding this limitation helps clarify what a conviction represents. It is not a statement about every possible allegation. It is a legal determination based on specific, defined charges that were tested in court. In Maxwell's case, the charges were built from a combination of testimony, records, and investigative findings that prosecutors argued formed a consistent and provable pattern. These charges would later be examined, challenged, and ultimately decided upon by a jury. But before reaching that stage, each charge had to be clearly defined and supported. To understand what Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of, it is necessary to look at the individual charges presented in court. Each charge represents a specific legal claim, defined by federal law and supported by evidence introduced during the trial. The case against Maxwell included several counts, primarily focused on conspiracy and transportation-related offenses. One of the central charges was conspiracy to entice minors to travel for illegal purposes. In legal terms, conspiracy does not require that every act be carried out by the accused. Instead, prosecutors must show that there was an agreement between two or more individuals to engage in unlawful activity, and that the defendant knowingly participated in that agreement. This type of charge focuses on coordination and intent. Another key charge involved the transportation of minors with intent to engage in illegal activity. This charge is more specific. It requires prosecutors to demonstrate that transportation occurred, or was arranged, with a particular purpose defined by law. Evidence for this type of charge often includes travel records, timelines, and supporting testimony. In addition to these, there were charges related to conspiracy to engage in illegal conduct involving minors. These counts again emphasized the idea of coordinated action rather than isolated behavior. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed a pattern of involvement that met the legal definition of conspiracy. Each of these charges has distinct elements. For a conviction, the jury must find that every required element of a charge has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If even one element is not sufficiently supported, that specific count cannot result in a conviction. This is why cases often include multiple counts. Each count is evaluated separately, based on the evidence presented. A defendant may be found guilty on some counts and not guilty on others, depending on how the jury interprets the evidence in relation to each charge. Another important factor is evidentiary support. The charges against Maxwell were built using a combination of witness testimony, travel records, and other documentation. These sources were presented together to demonstrate how the legal elements of each charge were met. At this stage, the charges are still allegations. They represent claims made by prosecutors, supported by evidence, but not yet confirmed. The role of the trial is to test these claims through examination and cross-examination. Only after this process can a verdict be reached. Understanding the structure of the charges is essential because it defines what the jury is being asked to decide. It also sets the boundaries for what a conviction will ultimately represent. Once the charges against Ghislaine Maxwell were defined, the next step in the legal process was to support those charges with evidence. In a criminal trial, this is where allegations are tested, by presenting material that demonstrates how each legal element of a charge is met. The prosecution relied on a combination of evidence types. No single source was sufficient on its own. Instead, the case was built through the alignment of witness testimony, documented records, and timeline analysis. Witness testimony played a central role. Individuals who testified described their experiences, interactions, and the environments in which events occurred. These accounts were used to establish context and narrative, explaining how the alleged actions took place. However, testimony alone is not enough. For it to carry weight, it must be evaluated alongside other evidence. This is where corroboration becomes essential. Prosecutors supported testimony with documented records. These included travel-related data, communication records, and other materials that helped place individuals in specific locations at particular times. When these records aligned with witness accounts, they strengthened the overall argument. For example, if testimony described a specific event occurring at a certain time and place, and records confirmed that relevant individuals were present during that period, the combined evidence formed a corroborated timeline. Timeline construction was a key strategy. By organizing events in chronological order, prosecutors aimed to show patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. Repetition across different times and locations was used to support the claim that the actions described were not random. Another important element was consistency. When multiple witnesses described similar interactions or environments, and those descriptions aligned with available records, the evidentiary structure became more cohesive. Consistency across independent sources increases reliability and legal analysis. At the same time, the evidence was subject to scrutiny. Each piece had to meet standards of admissibility and relevance. Only material that could be verified and directly related to the charges was presented in court. This ensured that the case remained focused on provable claims, rather than broader or unverified information. It is also important to note that evidence must address specific legal elements. For each charge, prosecutors needed to demonstrate not just that events occurred, but that those events satisfied the definitions required under the law, such as intent, knowledge, or participation. This is where structure matters. Evidence is not presented randomly. It is organized to show how individual pieces connect, forming a logical and legally relevant sequence. By the end of this stage, the charges were no longer abstract. They were supported by a framework of testimony and records designed to demonstrate how each element could be proven. But presenting evidence is only one side of the process. In any criminal trial, the prosecution's evidence is only one part of the process. Equally important is how that evidence is challenged by the defense. This stage ensures that all claims are tested under rigorous legal standards before any conclusion is reached. The defense's role is not to prove an alternative narrative. Instead, it is to question whether the prosecution has met the required burden of proof. In criminal cases, that burden is high. Guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. To do this, the defense focuses on weaknesses, inconsistencies, and gaps in the evidence. One of the primary areas of challenge is witness testimony. Because testimony relies on memory and personal experience, it can vary in detail and perspective. The defense may highlight inconsistencies between different statements, question timelines, or point out areas where recollection is unclear. This process occurs through cross-examination. Witnesses are asked detailed questions about their accounts, including prior statements, specific dates, and contextual details. The goal is to test credibility and reliability, identifying whether the testimony can be consistently supported. Another area of focus is interpretation of records. Documents such as travel logs or communication records may confirm that individuals were present or in contact, but they do not always define the purpose of that interaction. The defense may argue that such records are ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. This distinction is important. Evidence that shows association does not automatically prove involvement in illegal activity. The defense may emphasize that connection alone is insufficient to meet legal standards. The defense may also address incomplete evidence. Not all records are available, and not all events are fully documented. Missing emails, partial timelines, or gaps in documentation can be used to argue that the overall picture is inconclusive. This introduces reasonable doubt. If the evidence leaves room for alternative explanations, the defense can argue that the prosecution has not met its burden. Even small uncertainties, when combined, can affect how the case is evaluated. Another strategy involves challenging intent. For many charges, it is not enough to show that events occurred. The prosecution must demonstrate that the defendant acted with specific knowledge or purpose. The defense may argue that intent has not been clearly established by the available evidence. Throughout this process, the focus remains on legal standards, not speculation. The defense does not need to disprove every claim. It only needs to show that the evidence presented is not sufficient to reach a definitive conclusion under the law. This creates a balance within the trial. The prosecution presents a structured argument supported by evidence. The defense tests that argument by identifying its limits. Together, these opposing approaches ensure that the final decision is based on carefully examined and challenged material. By the end of this stage, the evidence has been fully presented and scrutinized. After both the prosecution and defense presented their arguments, the case moved to one of the most critical stages: jury deliberation. This is where all evidence, testimony, and legal arguments are carefully reviewed to determine whether each charge has been proven. The jury's role is highly structured. They are not asked to decide based on opinion or general impressions. Instead, they must evaluate whether the prosecution has met the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt for each individual count. This means every charge is considered separately. A jury does not deliver a single, overall judgment. Instead, they assess each count based on the evidence that specifically relates to it. This is why a defendant can be found guilty on some charges and not guilty on others. The process begins with reviewing the evidence. Jurors consider witness testimony, documented records, and the arguments presented by both sides. They may revisit key points, compare timelines, and examine how different pieces of evidence align. Consistency plays a major role. When testimony is supported by records, and multiple sources point to the same conclusion, it strengthens the case. Jurors look for these points of alignment when determining reliability. At the same time, they must consider uncertainty. If evidence is incomplete, inconsistent, or open to multiple interpretations, jurors must evaluate whether that uncertainty creates reasonable doubt. Even if a claim seems plausible, it cannot result in a conviction unless the required standard is met. Another important factor is credibility. Jurors assess how believable and consistent witnesses are, how clearly evidence has been presented, and whether the arguments made by each side are logically supported. This involves both factual analysis and careful judgment. The judge provides legal instructions to guide this process. These instructions explain the elements of each charge and define what must be proven. Jurors use these guidelines to ensure that their decision is based on law, not assumption. Deliberation itself is a collaborative process. Jurors discuss the case together, compare interpretations, and work toward agreement. They must reach a unanimous decision for each count in order to deliver a verdict. This stage can take time. Complex cases involving multiple charges and large volumes of evidence require detailed discussion. Jurors must carefully consider each element before reaching a conclusion. By the end of deliberation, the jury arrives at a set of decisions, one for each charge. These decisions represent the outcome of the entire process. Evidence presented by the prosecution, challenges raised by the defense, careful evaluation under legal standards. Only after this process is complete is a verdict announced. After the jury completed its deliberations, the outcome of the case was delivered through a count-by-count verdict. This means that each charge brought against Ghislaine Maxwell was evaluated separately, based on the evidence and legal standards discussed during the trial. The jury ultimately found Maxwell guilty on multiple counts. These included charges related to conspiracy and the transportation of minors for illegal purposes. The convictions reflected the jury's determination that the prosecution had successfully proven the required elements of these charges beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, the verdict was not uniform across all counts. Maxwell was found not guilty on at least one charge, demonstrating how each count was considered independently. This outcome highlights an important feature of the legal process. A verdict is not an all-or-nothing decision, but a structured evaluation of individual allegations. Each guilty verdict carries specific meaning. It indicates that, for that particular charge, the jury concluded that the evidence, testimony, records, and supporting material met the legal threshold required for conviction. This includes establishing elements such as knowledge, intent, and participation, depending on the nature of the charge. The not guilty verdict also has a clear interpretation. It does not necessarily mean that the events described did not occur. Rather, it means that the jury determined the evidence presented was not sufficient to meet the required standard of proof for that specific count. This distinction is critical. Legal outcomes are based on evidence and standards, not on assumptions or incomplete information. Each decision reflects the jury's assessment of whether the prosecution met its burden for that charge. The structure of the verdict provides insight into how the evidence was interpreted. Where the jury found strong alignment between testimony and records, convictions were reached. Where uncertainty or insufficient support existed, the standard for conviction was not met. This balanced outcome reflects the function of the trial process. It is designed to test each allegation individually, ensuring that conclusions are based on carefully evaluated evidence rather than broad generalizations. Following the verdict, the case moved into the next phase, sentencing. At this stage, the court determines the consequences associated with the convictions, taking into account the nature of the offenses and applicable legal guidelines. But before examining sentencing, it is important to understand what the verdict establishes. It defines which charges were proven, and therefore what legal responsibility has been confirmed through the trial. Following the jury's verdict, the case entered the sentencing phase, where the court determines the legal consequences of the convictions. This stage is separate from the trial itself. While the jury decides guilt, the judge is responsible for assigning a sentence based on established legal guidelines. Sentencing is not arbitrary. It is guided by a structured framework that considers the nature of the offenses, the evidence presented, and federal sentencing standards. These guidelines are designed to promote consistency while allowing the court to account for the specifics of each case. One of the primary factors is the severity of the charges. Different offenses carry different potential penalties. Charges involving conspiracy and transportation-related crimes are evaluated based on their legal definitions and the circumstances under which they occurred. Another key element is the factual record established during trial. The judge may consider how the offenses were carried out, the patterns demonstrated in the evidence, and the scope of the conduct is supported by testimony and documentation. At this stage, both sides may present arguments. The prosecution can argue for a sentence that reflects the seriousness of the convictions, while the defense may present factors intended to mitigate the outcome. These can include arguments related to the defendant's background, conduct, or other relevant considerations permitted by law. The court must balance these perspectives. The goal is to arrive at a sentence that is consistent with legal standards while reflecting the specific details of the case. In Maxwell's case, the court ultimately imposed a significant term of imprisonment. This sentence reflected the convictions reached by the jury and the court's evaluation of the applicable guidelines. It marked the formal conclusion of the trial process and established the legal consequences of the case. It is important to understand what sentencing represents. It is not a reassessment of guilt. That determination has already been made by the jury. Instead, sentencing defines the legal outcome of those findings, translating verdicts into concrete penalties. Another aspect of this phase is post-sentencing procedure. Following sentencing, a defendant has the right to pursue legal options such as appeals. These processes focus on whether the trial and sentencing were conducted in accordance with the law, rather than re-evaluating the evidence itself. This means that the legal process can continue even after a sentence is imposed. However, the sentence remains the official outcome unless modified through legal review. By this stage, the case has moved from allegation to verdict to consequence. The convictions have been defined, and the legal penalties have been established. With the verdict delivered and sentencing completed, the case reaches a point where the focus shifts from process to interpretation of what has been legally established. This stage is about understanding what the convictions actually confirm, and just as importantly, what they do not. A conviction defines specific legal responsibility. In Maxwell's case, the guilty verdicts confirm that the jury found sufficient evidence to prove certain charges beyond a reasonable doubt. These findings are not general. They apply only to the counts that were charged, tested, and proven in court. This creates a clear boundary. The convictions establish that particular actions, as defined by law, were supported by evidence. These include elements such as participation, knowledge, and coordination, depending on the charge. However, the scope remains limited. The case does not determine every aspect of the broader investigation or every possible allegation. It focuses only on the charges that were formally presented during the trial. This distinction is essential for accurate interpretation. It separates legally proven facts from broader narratives that may exist outside the courtroom. While additional information may be discussed in public or in investigative materials, only the evidence that met legal standards contributes to the conviction. Another important aspect is how evidence was evaluated. The convictions indicate that the jury found strong alignment between different types of evidence, such as testimony and documented records. This alignment is what allowed the prosecution to meet the required burden of proof. At the same time, the outcome also reflects where limits existed. Counts that did not result in conviction demonstrate that, for those specific charges, the evidence was not sufficient to meet the same standard. This reinforces the idea that each allegation was assessed independently. The result is a structured set of conclusions. Some elements were confirmed through the legal process. Others remain unproven within that framework. This does not weaken the case, it defines its boundaries. Understanding these boundaries helps clarify what the trial contributes to the broader picture. It provides verified findings, but it does not attempt to resolve every question or detail connected to the wider context. Another key takeaway is the role of legal standards. Convictions are not based on probability or assumption. They require evidence that is clear, consistent, and strong enough to meet a defined threshold. This ensures that conclusions are grounded in tested and reliable material. By this stage, the case has produced a set of legally established facts. These facts form the foundation for understanding Maxwell's role as determined by the court. After the legal process concludes, the meaning of a conviction extends beyond the courtroom into public interpretation and broader analysis. This stage is shaped by how verified findings are understood, discussed, and placed within a wider context. The starting point is legal clarity. The convictions establish what has been proven under strict evidentiary standards. These findings represent confirmed outcomes, based on evidence that has been presented, challenged, and accepted in court. However, public understanding often includes more than just these confirmed elements. Reports, prior investigations, and released documents may contain additional information that was not part of the trial. This creates a distinction between legally established facts and broader contextual material. Maintaining that distinction is essential. Legal conclusions are precise and limited to specific charges. Public discussion, by contrast, may explore wider questions, connections, or timelines that extend beyond what was formally tested in court. Another important factor is media interpretation. Journalists and analysts play a key role in explaining the outcome of complex cases. They translate legal language into accessible narratives, highlighting key evidence, summarizing testimony, and explaining the significance of the verdict. This process can influence emphasis. Some coverage may focus on the confirmed convictions, while other reporting may examine the broader context, including associated records or historical information. As a result, different audiences may come away with varying levels of detail and perspective. Public interpretation is also shaped by available documentation. Court records, transcripts, and official filings provide direct insight into the case. These materials allow for independent review, enabling observers to examine how conclusions were reached. At the same time, not all information is equally accessible or complete. Some documents may be partial, and some aspects of the broader investigation may not be publicly available. This can lead to gaps in understanding, which are sometimes filled through interpretation or analysis. This is where careful evaluation becomes important. Distinguishing between what is verified, what is reported, and what is uncertain helps maintain accuracy. Without this distinction, different types of information can become blurred. The Maxwell case illustrates this dynamic clearly. The trial produced specific, legally confirmed findings. At the same time, it exists within a larger context that continues to be examined through reporting and analysis. This creates a layered understanding. Court-established facts define what has been proven. Additional records and reporting provide broader context. Ongoing discussion shapes how the case is interpreted over time. Recognizing these layers allows for a more accurate and balanced view. By this stage, the legal outcome is clear, but its interpretation continues to evolve. After examining the charges, evidence, trial process, verdict, and broader interpretation, a clear and structured understanding emerges of what Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of, and what those convictions represent. At its core, the outcome of the case is defined by specific, legally proven charges. These convictions were not based on general association or public narrative. They were the result of a formal process in which evidence was presented, challenged, and evaluated under strict legal standards. The jury found Maxwell guilty on multiple counts, primarily related to conspiracy and transportation-based offenses involving minors. Each of these counts required the prosecution to prove distinct legal elements, including knowledge, participation, and intent. These elements are critical. A conviction does not simply confirm that events occurred. It confirms that the defendant's actions met the precise definitions established by law, supported by evidence that satisfied the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, the outcome reflects the structure of the trial process. Each charge was evaluated independently. Some counts resulted in conviction, while at least one did not. This demonstrates that the jury carefully assessed each allegation based on the evidence presented for that specific count. This selective outcome is important. It shows that the verdict was not a broad judgment, but a detailed evaluation of individual claims, reinforcing the principle that legal responsibility must be established case by case. Another key point is the scope of the convictions. The trial addressed defined charges within a particular timeframe and evidentiary framework. As a result, the convictions establish what was proven in court, but they do not attempt to resolve every aspect of the broader investigation. This creates a clear boundary. What is confirmed through conviction? What remains outside the scope of the trial? Understanding this boundary is essential for accurate interpretation. The case also highlights how different forms of evidence, testimony, records, and documented associations were combined to support legal conclusions. These elements worked together to create a structured argument that could be tested and ultimately accepted in court. In final terms, Maxwell's convictions represent legally established responsibility for specific criminal conduct, evidence that met the highest standard of proof, a defined outcome within a limited but clearly structured case. Beyond these conclusions, the broader context remains a subject of continued analysis and discussion. But the legal record itself is clear. It provides a verified, evidence-based determination of what was proven, how it was proven, and what those findings mean within the framework of the law. In conclusion, understanding what Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of requires focusing not on speculation, but on documented charges, tested evidence, and confirmed legal outcomes, the elements that define the case in its final and most authoritative form. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.